anybody's, I don't know if anybody's read that. I mean, it's a New York Times bestseller. She's that kind of thing, which is, it's a popular economic text that says economic thinking, as it's mainstream economic thinking, is a load of old hoo-ha. We heard all that yesterday. It's completely ideological, etc., etc. How do we rethink the economy from a human point of view, from a human needs point of view? And she talks about her donut, which I think is a terrible metaphor, talking about metaphors, but, let's not go there. She talks about how we've got to provide for the social foundations, the basic needs of everybody. And that's, if you like, the small hole in the middle is the floor through which nobody should be allowed to fall. And we've got to do it within planetary limits. And we've got to do it within planetary limits, and we beyond the outer edge of the donuts, we're in, get 4 more new planets territory. Okay, so that's the general idea. There is a lot of thinking around this. There's a whole series of thinking, very practical, coming out of new economic foundations, various kind of small left of centre think tanks, and lots of it. And of course, since the pandemic, there's been a lot of stuff coming out from, I don't know, the Australia Institute, various writings, a whole range of them, which I can list should you want, about, what do we do after the pandemic? We can't go back to where we were. The neoliberalism is finished. Joe Biden's set the seal on that. Where do we go next? And there's a whole range of things. So donut economics, social foundation. The social foundations were very much built around the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. So there's 17, I believe. Access to clean water, access to work, education, gender equality, etc., etc. We've got other things like, for instance, the social guarantee, which is linked to everybody's right to basic services and to employment. So, basic guaranteed employment. We heard yesterday various mentions about universal basic income. This falls in that thing. There are other things such as the universal basic services, and I won't get into the debates around them, but the idea that everybody should have access to some basic services that are provided collectively, mostly free, not entirely free, but they're collectively provided. So utilities, water, housing, education, health, etc. So all these kind of things there. There's a group that I was particularly struck by called the Foundational Economy Group, who tried to give this some kind of policy base. And I'll talk about them a little bit in a moment. But it's the idea that how do we guarantee the social foundations? What is the foundational economy? And they split it up in different ways. Now, there are lots of, as I say, a lot of books come out about this, and I'm just in Australia. So Per Capita, for instance, which is kind of a Labour-aligned think tank, what's she called? Emma Dawson, wrote a big book, collected, what do we do after the pandemic? Education, social services, etc. No mention of art and culture. Jess Scully writes a book. I think she was writing it before the pandemic, but Jess Scully is I think she's deputy mayor or something in Sydney at the moment, city of Sydney. Herself a creative, she describes herself as a creative. Lots of great ideas about citizen participation, participatory budgeting, a whole range of things. Great. Not one mention of art and culture. I actually signed up for something the other day called a conference on the state of Australian cities. It's kind of the general, I think it's annual, might be biannual, but anyway, it's the usual, it's the annual, this is where we are with Australian cities. 6 themes: ecology, health, economics, not one mention of culture, never mind art, in any of the strands. So it seems to me really interesting. This is going to be my first question. How on earth did we get to the situation where we're not talking the coalition now, we're not talking neoliberals, etc. We're talking a generally left of centre, well, centre and left, heterodox economic and political movements, not even mentioning art and culture. It's just not in the equation. How do we get to that? One difference, quite interesting, one difference is I came across this thing called Regenerating Melbourne, or Regen Melbourne, and I think I'm still trying to get hold of them properly, but they came out of the Committee for Melbourne and a few other things. You would imagine a kind of centrist, great and the good kind of think tank, if we can call it that. Anyway, they got Kate Raworth over from the UK, and they did lots of community consultation. What's the foundations? How do we have Melbourne, the Melbourne donut, they call it? What's in that Melbourne donut? And there, right next to clean water, access to health and education, is art and culture. And I wrote to them, I said, well, how come this is in? They said, yes, it's really interesting because 85% of our respondents mentioned this as part of that basics. Now, that might be because they're all latte sipping communists in Melbourne, I don't know, but interesting. And so it was a popular input into that got art and culture in there. So that struck me as really interesting. Now, if you go back a bit, which I did, you go back to the 1948 United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, Article 27(1) is, everyone has the right to freely participate in the cultural life of the community, to enjoy the arts and to share in scientific advancement and its benefits. This was reaffirmed in the 1966 United Nations Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, Introduction of Cultural Rights, interesting. Article 15A, the right to fully participate in culture, etc. So for a long time, certainly up till I would say that certainly up till the last 20 or 30 years, cultural rights, the right to participate in culture, was always part of this kind of general kind of, social citizenship, cultural citizenship. I mentioned social citizenship, and I'm going to, my last quote, this is famously T.H. Marshall, a British sociologist, 1949, defines what he calls social citizenship. And he says, in the 18th century, we gained civic citizenship, habeas corpus, basic human rights, if you want to call it, not human rights, civic rights. In the 19th century, we got political rights, freedom, constitutions, votes, fourth estate, etc., etc. Social citizenship, he says, it comes across the 20th century, and he defines it as granting the right to a modicum of economic welfare and security, and the right to share to the full in the social heritage and to live the life of a civilized being according to the standards prevalent in society. Clearly, it doesn't actually say cultural, but it's clearly the same kind of area. This is participation in the life of society. It's about education, but it's also about the cultural and scientific life, the artistic and scientific life. So it's there. Just my final one, it would be, I can only say his first name, Amitabh Sen and Martha Nussbaum, their capabilities approach. I won't bother quoting it, but they do clearly identify the ability to participate in art and culture, not just access, but the means to make sense of it, to fully express themselves. That is an essential human right. So we've got a tradition of cultural rights, and we can talk about what that means later. And yet, after 40 years of let's say neoliberalism, when we've come out the other end, we've got heterodox economics, left-wing thinkers say, let's redefine the economy to serve human needs. Art and culture is not there. And I find that really disturbing. And I think that's a real question for the art and cultural sector. Why we're not, as I say, never mind liberals, this is the left, we're not there. So what does that mean? So I've just been working a bit on around the foundational economy people, and I can send details if you're interested. But they try to, rather than, it's not a theoretical thing, they just say, look, let's go in and say the economy, GDP, one thing. It's just meaningless. We know this attack on GDP. It's an aggregate. Not even its founder believes in GDP anymore. It's some kind of aggregate. Let's break it down. And they say, well, let's break it down on human needs. What have we got? We've got material infrastructure, transport, water, utilities, the technical systems upon which we rely. That's a kind of ones that when they break down, it's headline news. All right? So there's a material infrastructure that's there. We've got a social infrastructure. We've got health, we've got education, we've got social services, we've got public administration, prisons, police, horseback riding or otherwise. Got all that there. Social infrastructure. Then they say just above that, we've got what they call the everyday, or they call it the everyday or the overlooked, very basic stuff. Things that they're not absolutely essential, but without which you wouldn't describe it as a good life. Cafes, hairdressers, nail bars, I'm trying to think of it, I don't know, but car repair shops, the simple car repair shop. Basic, small, everyday economies. And they contrast this, for instance, with the creative industries. The only time they mention the creative industries is saying, you get 3 spotty 22-year-olds over a laptop, and that's the cutting edge of economic redevelopment. Whereas, 500 local workers making affordable sofas, affordable furniture is absolutely ignored. So this is the everyday economy. And they say, and they've done it, and I've actually done it for Australia statistically. These economies, just on employment and GVA and all that, standard economic measures, these account for something between 60 and 70% of the whole economy. And it's the last 30%, what they call the transactional economy. This is the one that those guys that John Quiggin called, bank employees on the ABC breakfast, what they're talking about. So that's 30% of the economy. So here we've got a big chunk of the economy that's organized around basic needs. Okay, we get to that when reading that foundational economy. Again, art and culture are not there. The only time they appear is when there's a bit on material infrastructure, when they mention fiber optics, internet. And the other bit is, that culture is a discretionary spend. So if we give everybody basic services, that frees up, free and collectively provided, that frees up income for them to spend on entertainment and culture. So again, what I've been interested in is saying, here we have a really well thought out position. It's broken down, it's practicable, it's actionable in the sense of, you can go off and get some statistics about it. Basic infrastructure, or even every day, where's the art and culture? So my interest would be, what would it look like in there? And the question then I would ask is, how, even at this, whether we're talking from the point of view of citizenship, social and cultural citizenship, or from these foundational economies, these basic needs economies, where does art and culture sit within that? And so that it's quite a complicated job. We've got, at one end, they mentioned the internet, basic service, television, basic service. But of course, at the same time, what's coming through the television are things made in Los Angeles, if you like, or, Korea, if that's your bend. So we've got that. And we've got basic services such as arts education. Why is art not in education? Arts education not basic. Where's the libraries, community centres, parks? They mentioned, parks and those kind of infrastructure. The built infrastructure of towns and cities. All these kind of things. Even and this is before you get to theatres and other kind of those infrastructures. So I suppose my interest is twofold. What do we mean when the art and culture are part of the basic needs? Is that can we couch it in those terms, basic needs? Because of course, some of the definitions of art are that it's not basic needs. It comes after the basic needs. There's the most annoying and yet all-pervasive thing called Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which I'm going to shoot anybody who ever mentions that again. He was a marketing executive somewhere in America. This idea that first we get the basics, then we get, I'm not going to go through it, but we get basic material things, we get human relationships, we get affirmation, and then finally self-realization. And it's seen as this universal character. And on my reckoning, that was sorted out sometime when I've moved into a cave, I've dragged me woman in with the hair, I've got me woolly bison cooking on the stove. Hey, let's go and do some wall paintings. It's a complete ridiculous schema. And if you speak to anybody from Aboriginal communities or Indigenous communities anyway, cultures is a basic need. So we've got a model that cultures comes after everything, and yet, how is it a basic need? What does it mean when it's a basic need? Especially for the last 200 years, culture's been opposed to the economy, been opposed to utilitarianism, which has colonized basic need. So I suppose what I'm going to leave it here. I'm saying there's a lot of discourse about culture as something going above the economy, above basic needs, and yet for a long time, certainly up to the last 40 years, it was integrated. The social citizen, cultural citizen, art and culture is some kind of human right that should be satisfied. And yet here we are in a world where nobody's talking about that, not even the left. It's a peripheral concern. And how do we get out of it? So my three questions would be, how do we get into this place? Why are we in that place where nobody concerns themselves with art and culture except us as a matter of public policy? Is art a basic need? What does it mean for art and culture to be basic needs? How do we understand that? And the third one is that how then would we like to see art and culture as part of what we might call the social foundations given to everyone, whether that's a collective service or an ensured provision on behalf of the state? What would that look like when you need to provide art and culture because that's a basic human right and essential to our citizenship? What would that now look like in 2021? Okay.
That's fantastic. That's so provocative. But of course, in some ways, you're preaching to the choir here. Yeah, we get that. So your questions are actually bang on. You spoke for very nearly half an hour. So, no, it's looking great. So I'm just going to pop up the questions as you frame them. In a manner which recognizes this. I'm sorry, I'm trying to gloss them quickly. Primordial quality of art. So the second one I didn't finish before my clumsy fingers tapped. So is art and culture a basic human, and it's interesting what we frame that next word as, actually. Need implies something actually exterior to us, whereas I think there's an argument here that that art and culture is intrinsic to being the kind of beings that we are, and that in fact, we're not Homo sapiens in a sense, we're Homo culturans, or something.
Poiesis, yeah.
Yeah. The kind of beings we are beings which not only self-express, because I think that's another difficult discourse, but I definitely say that we try to make sense of what and who we are, and that one of the key ways in which we do that is through practices which we might identify as art and culture. And I think that one of the things that's been done to us one of the things that's happened is that we've kind of fallen for a narrative that science looks after those questions for us. Yeah. So, and as you say, that cultural, etc., these different practices are epiphenomenal rather than being intrinsic to us. Fantastic provocation. So listen, I'm going to break us into the rooms, and basically here the idea is have at it, have at those 3 questions, and in half an hour we'll come back together. Okay, and we'll hear from each other, and I think we probably will have time to bat it around a little bit. Wonderful presentation. Thank you, Justin. I've also put in the chat that maybe we should be compiling a reading list out of this as well, because I suspect one of the, in response to your 3rd question, it's quite a practical question. How can the kind of people that we have in this room seek to intervene in those various fora in which these ideas are being belted around? So thanks. Throw us into the rooms, 10:41. So I'm going to ask someone from room 1. You probably don't remember which room you were in.
Who is room 1, Max? Tell us.
Who was it? Oh, no, let me do it another way. Which room?
I can tell you. It's Amanda Morris, Joe Cost, John, Justin.
Okay.
That was group 1.
Would any of those people like to sort of hit us up with a brief précis of what might have been talked about in that room? No pressure.
Tell us a little. Go on.
Joe, you're on mute.
Oh, sorry, I was on mute. I said I was going to try and dob Kate in.
I think Joe Cost was starting to talk.
Oh, right. There you go.
Well, they can hear. Yeah. Can you hear me now? Hello.
Yes. Yeah. I can hear you, Catherine.
Sorry, I've been listening to the story so far, but I haven't been able to speak.
Okay. Well, we're just doing a little bit.
And now I'm not sure what I'm supposed to be doing.
Well, just have a listen for a little while longer, Catherine. We're just reporting back from the little groups that we've been discussing in.
Okay.
And then when we're done with that, we're going to have a general chat, and people.
I'm vocal at last, so that's.
Can I just ask whoever's operating the Zoom, if you're able to mute and unmute Catherine at times necessary, that might be helpful.
Go there, Bella. Yeah.
Thank you.
So, Joe, were you going to?
No, it was Kate.
Okay, Kate. Hi, Kate.
I'm being dubbed in.
Yeah.
Hi, everyone. We had a wide-ranging conversation. Starting with talking about how do we define culture and art, and how they come to some kind of mean 2 separate things, and that certainly in the last several years culture has become more intrinsic, and the semantics around art persists as some kind of elitist optional add-on. We talked about part of that is because we're stuck in a resourcing cycle, so that our arts agencies may still give the impression of elitism, but that's because they don't have the resources to support everything that they would like to support. And so around and round we go. Combined with obviously the loss of some things that used to support, used to make it easier for arts and culture to be more intrinsic, for us to have that equity of being able to express ourselves and being able to participate in, and things that we've lost, like the lack of free education, the affordability of creative space, certainly in cities, and the loss of other resources, as well as policy and government changes that have seen governments disinvest and devalue and devolve their responsibilities to the market. And we ended with the thought that we need to see significant investment in order to bring culture back into the public realm in a really significant way.
A significant investment on the part of government?
I don't think we broke it down, but across the board, yes.
And just stitching it up, sort of pulling together with this notion of what I've put in the notes there is devolution of responsibility to market. It seems to me that one of the things that's happened with COVID and with Biden arguably is a rethinking of the role of government more generally. So that might be something to leap onto. So I'll just put in the chat a little gloss of your comments there, so I can have a look at that. Group, is that enough from your group? Anybody want to add anything to that? Okay. The second group, who was that?
The second group was David, Ian, Mark, and your group.
Does anybody from the group, Stephen, you were working your way to a nice peroration before, maybe we could.
I'm not sure I'll do it justice, but I would just like to pick up on where Kate left off around investment. That one of the key sort of metaphors that sort of arose through the conversation was the way in which the arts are a kind of mycelium, or a kind of mitochondrial connective force. If we're thinking about society as an ecosystem, the arts are like the kind of the fungal network that is invisible below the surface, but essential in connecting, and kind of every other organism is dependent on it. That may go some way to explaining why the arts are kind of invisible and maybe ignored, or just not sufficiently acknowledged. But also, David sort of led us to the point that the ecosystem is generally now exhausted. So, like, across so many of our societal areas, and that maybe it's needing nutrient, and maybe that nutrient is investment. Getting back to your point, Kate, maybe that's what the nutrient needs to be, is substantial investment. Nicole kind of talked quite a bit about the kind of fracturing forces of the arts being kind of framed as a competitive environment, and the way in which that has sort of forced the arts into a kind of self-defeating, elitist kind of battlefield within itself, and that maybe that's been a force for why the arts have become undermined, even within our own kind of structures. And I guess where I was going, just as the group ended, was that in response to Justin's question, what would it look like if the arts and culture were a more seen as a more basic fundamental need in society? That kind of the idea of connectivity and cooperation, sort of culture building, as being maybe a direct result of what the arts would offer to our culture, to offer to our society. There are probably lots of things I've missed.
Thanks, Stephen. Does anybody else from that group want to add anything to that? Nicole did talk about one expression you used, Nicole, I'm verbaling you a little bit here, was educating our way out of this. And Nicole was wondering about the place for building students working in kind of vocational arts training, practice training, skilling them up with professional capital, the capacity to advocate, to put them into rooms with people who need to be influenced, etc. Was that capturing some of what you were saying, Nicole?
Yeah, I just think that, you know, when we train artists, we can't just train them in the art form. We need to be training them in advocacy and leadership, and also I think empowering young people to as soon as they graduate, get on that train and not think I'll just, you know, wait till I'm 35 or 40 or someone invites me and then I'll step up and start taking some decisions, because also too, you know, I suppose if we think about, you know, Lyndon Terracini, I did a project for Opera Australia, and he talked about the face of Australia. Well, you don't see the face of Australia at the opera. If you have a look at all the people you see in Circular Quay on the way to the Opera House, that might be the face of Australia. So, you know, where is the face of Australia on our panels, in our discussion groups? You know, where are the parents? Where, you know, there's just all sorts of things where, you know, I think the next generation of artists are very switched on about those things. You know, my students talk a lot about diversity and inclusivity and equity, and you know, just I have students saying that they would not dream of ever performing in a jazz ensemble if it was not equal in terms of gender.
Yeah, but you know, one of the yeah, absolutely, and I guess my concern here is that just as culture and arts is disappearing from even heterodox narratives, so is education. Beyond very instrumental ideas of preparing people, you know, work-ready students is the kind of trope. And what we're seeing across a number of universities is the very sites in which this training might take place being dismantled. So the number of theatre and performance programs that are being dismantled at this moment across the place is basically a clear felling across Australia. And, you know, we saw nothing in Albanese's budget reply speech which went to higher education at all. So, you know, I kind of I sort of think, oh gosh, well, we're just losing the programs in which we can do this kind of education. That's me editorialising. Okay, group 3, what was the other group?
I think that might be us. I didn't take any notes, so I'll just try and wing it a bit, see if I can get the major points in, but maybe have Alison and Harriet will...
if anyone can do it, you can, Julian.
Chip in. Thanks so much. One thing, listening to Larry, who has a policy background and is involved in the policy process with the cultural policy process with the City of Sydney, with Alison and her, you know, Asia Link background, and with Kim with his ABC background, I've noticed that when people talk, particularly people like Alison, Larry, and Kim, that they communicate a lot of experience. And while we can approach these questions in the abstract, and I personally would talk forever if I could about them, I think there may be, for all of us, the resource that we have is our own experience. And there is a need to listen, I feel it, as a benefit, not a chore, very, very carefully to the smaller narratives, to the stories that we're telling each other. Because I think that when Kim talks about the ABC, or Alison the visual arts, or Larry policy, comes at these questions from that context, a very particular kind of truth emerges from it. And I don't think those truths amalgamate. You know, I don't think they all kind of go into some gigantic milk bottle and then you kind of go, well, that's it, that's arts policy. I think that the need to listen to those kind of medium level stories, as it were, is extremely acute if we're going to deal with some of these larger problems. So just in terms of what we talked about, Ben Eltham mentioned the work that he's been doing with Justin, basically on codes and taking a foundational economy approach to the Australian economy, and you know, the kind of the categories that are used to describe what is kind of valuable economic work. So Ben just mentioned that. Then Larry talks a little bit from his perspective in terms of the City of Sydney and policies, and I suppose an everyday practice. And we did discuss, probably at length, but with no particular answer, why culture had disappeared from the policy discourse. And Larry did mention, it's stuck in my mind, that the media have a role to play in this, that there is a certain perception that the media have of what the arts are, and that they promulgate that. So we're not in an empty room. We're in a room where people often are presenting us in a certain way, or claiming to know what it is that we do. Alison mentioned
just the narratives we need to be telling the story better.
Yeah. And so we spent a little bit of time.
As you said, it doesn't matter which narrative it is, as long as the narrative is telling and communicative of a wider truth or a wider wisdom or a wider whatever it is that we are all on about.
Yeah, that's right. So we talked a little bit about the, whether we missed an opportunity to tell a story, and Larry mentioned John Daly's recent report, and I tried not to sound too sour and grumpy about that report because it has so many mistakes in it, and is also saying something that I said 10 years ago at length, and so it's kind of hard for me to kind of go, oh, well, people are now listening because somebody is saying it worse who has no arts background. But anyway, leaving that aside and moving on, Kim then talked in terms of his perspective from the ABC. And I mean, I thought, Kim, you might want to kind of fill in some of the details, but what I particularly picked up there was, is it an art form or is it kind of an industry? I mean, like, which is it? And the answer is a bit of both, of course. It has a kind of large scale infrastructure, and it's also kind of art stuff. And Kim talked about, not at length, but we could have heard more about it, about the eviscerating impact that partisan politics has on institutions that are trying to kind of supply a unified public function, and that when they get caught up in that when they use as political footballs, which I think is the phrase that Kim used, then it's almost the end of the road. It has a terrible effect. And he said that's true of both sides of politics.
Yeah, could I just add? I was also, I might not have expressed it very well, but the thing that I was concerned about was that when in this question of how we got to how is it the arts has been left out of economic discussion and so on. I feel very strongly it relates to this the association that the left has with the idea of citizen rights, which then kind of forms this natural association with individualism, or we kind of fall into this trap of individualism. And that then leads to this, forms an alliance with the economic policy about the pursuit of self-interest, because the pursuit of self-interest and the pursuit of individual rights kind of go together. And so once you're there in that kind of utilitarian economic argument about, well, what interests me, then the arts necessarily kind of becomes, discretionary spending, and it becomes marginalised. So I really think that the left needs to think about this question of citizens' rights, natural rights versus individualism, whether it really wants them to have that close association.
Oh, bang, there's a big hand grenade being lobbed into it all. That was fantastic. Now, where's Justin? I'm trying to see you on my screen. There you are. We've brought this in quite nicely because we're heading for a little morning tea break. And without putting it on you to summarise or to do any wrapping up, it's just a topping and tailing, just giving you the floor for a couple of minutes to...
Yeah. Oh, well, let me just respond to the question of citizens' rights, which I absolutely don't think is an individualistic thing. The idea of a right is a collective right, and there are collective rights as well. So I think the kind of people talking about the right to a job guarantee, or the universal basic income, they talk about everybody's right, a universal right to something. We have a right to clean water. We've just had that ruling in the courts about the intergenerational justice and things like that. So rights can be and have been seen as collective things. So I don't think that's a problem. There is a little bit, I think, where there's a connection between the rise of neoliberalism, the individual pursuits, and human rights in that kind of way. There is a connection between those, which we don't need to go into. But I don't think that, I think the rights of citizens' rights is not a right-wing theme, or it's certainly not an individual thing. It is actually based on rights. But we can have arguments about that. I think the key thing is that where there are these collective demands for services and UBI and those kind of things, the arts and culture is not part of that, as I said. But if you go back into the past, you look at the histories out of which things like the Australia Council or the Cultural Policy After 45 came, they were very much about collective rights. That everybody's the cities, the City Beautiful movement, but also things like the communards. I always like the phrase of the communal luxury. Christine Ross uses that. Everybody's communal luxury. Somebody mentioned William Morris yesterday. Why should these things not be part of everybody's, the beauty of everyday life? Kropotkin makes the same kind of arguments. So this idea that we all should share in communal luxury, if that's the right word, if we should share in some kind of common standards of aesthetic beauty, pleasantness, whatever, has been long rooted in the left, and I think that went in the 80s. So I suppose my last thing, I actually think the cultural sector have got a lot to blame, because I think those debates in the 80s and 90s coming out of cultural studies, community arts, Borgiasian kind of sociology, they were really, really important, and they've shattered our sense of, white, male, Western-centric art. Great, but there's a real danger that they've taken down the idea of art per se. And I remember going to a cultural studies conference in Singapore or somewhere like Hong Kong, and I was in a bar and I said, "Oh, look, there are 780 papers at this cultural studies conference. Not a single one mentions the word art." And I can say I was laughed out of that bar. It was like, who talks about art? And yet every single one of those people in that conversation spends all their Sundays, going to art galleries and things like that. So it's the cultural sector itself that has lost the ability to say why art and culture are important, and prefer to self-flagellate about various things. We need to be absolutely self-critical, but we also need to realise that it is a basic need. And we've lost our ability to articulate that value, because I think we've lost a lot of the confidence in it. We need to sort that out, I think.
That's a fantastic way to wrap it up there. Thank you, Justin. Wow, hang on, I just need to finish typing that note. We need to be self-reflexive without disempowering ourselves. Yep. I'm going to wrap it up there, because it is now 11:36. And we are planning to return to do this all again at midday. Can I just get a little bit of feedback on that format? Do you think that works?
Yeah, it did for us.
Yeah, it is good. I'll try. I've kept quite a strong line of notes here in the chat, so I'll try to do that again next time, because I think it's nice to capture that. So if people are happy with running the rest of the day like this, I think we're seeing it work. I think that chance of actually reporting back from groups gives us the next layer of gloss, which is actually quite useful. So thank you very much for your attention, and we'll come back here at midday when we're turning to, oh no, David Pledger. Okay.
I'll make it.
Okay. Thanks for your attention, everybody, and see you. Yeah, you've got time to run and get a cup of coffee.
Thanks, Matt.
See you. Bye-bye.